remarkably busy time in Washington, and we here at NDN are very excited to host another in a series of events that we've done on this idea of internet freedom that has become, I think, a very important intellectual addition by the Obama administration to the foreign policy debate in our country. I'm Simon Rosenberg, the president of NDN, and I want to acknowledge Sam DuPont, who's sitting here, who will be moderating our Q&A after we hear from our two guests. Sam is a lead blogger, instigator, organizer, leader in our Global Mobile program, which is a wonderful program that's been looking at how the world was going to change because of the great changes in technology and global communications, that this idea that we are entering a period in human history when we will all be connected, which will come about sometime in the next 5 or 10 years, increasingly through these powerful mobile devices that we all carry around, that this moment in history presents extraordinary opportunity and also extraordinary challenges. And it's our just general belief, being optimists by nature, that the opportunity for good to come about through this emergence of this new sort of base of civil society that will allow average everyday people much more access to commerce and knowledge and education and all the things that are required for life success, that this really is an extraordinary moment, and that the opportunity, if we manage this correctly as people, to improve the lives of people all around the world has perhaps never been greater. And we view this rise of what we call global mobile as a great opportunity. We're also going to hear today about some of its challenges. And what I'm excited about in this discussion with two very prominent and thoughtful leaders on this issue is that we can't look at this debate through rose-colored glasses. I mean, there are enormous challenges ahead as every civil society in the world is going to try to find this space between the upside of this extraordinary revolution in technology and civil society and the challenges that it will also bring with it. So joining me today are two wonderful leaders and thought leaders on these matters. First is, and I'm going to try to get her name right, Anita Ramasastry, okay, who joined, we practiced, but I didn't pull it off, joined the U.S. Department of Commerce in September 2009. She's on leave from the University of Washington Law School, where she was a professor of law and a co-director of the Law, Technology, and Arts Group at the University of Washington. She has spent more than a decade as the co-director of the Schindler Center for Law, Commerce, and Technology, and among other subjects, she teaches and researches in the area of commercial law and electronic commerce. And she's going to be talking a little bit about the efforts in the Commerce Department to continue the free flow of information around the world. Our next speaker will be Daniel Calingaert, who most importantly is a Tufts grad. We are a little favorable to Tufts people here, as our staff knows, who graduated from Tufts in 1986. But more importantly, he oversees the Freedom's House wide range of civil society and media programs. He's also a professorial lecturer at American University, where he teaches courses on democracy. He's been at this, his bio is very long, and he's done a lot of remarkable things in this space. And we're very lucky to have him here. And in general, I just also want to say that I'm an enormous fan of Freedom House's work and have been through my entire adult life, and it's really an honor to have you here, Daniel. So, Anita, come on up, and why don't you start and lead us? And for those of you watching online, there will be an opportunity to join us in the Q&A and to ask questions online. Anita, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm a newcomer to Washington, D.C. I am a professor from Seattle, Washington, and I recently joined the government, and I'm pretending to be a bureaucrat for a while. So I'm here to talk to you about the Department of Commerce and some of the work that it's doing with respect to the free flow of information over the Internet. And I'm going to start with just a bit of background as to where we are with respect to what I call Internet policy. Within just this year,
Anita, your mic.
Sorry, there we go. Within the past year, the Department of Commerce. Wait, is that?
Yeah.
Great. Founded something called the Internet Policy Task Force. And so a variety of bureaus within the Department of Commerce are working together to look at what we should be doing with internet policy and regulation over the next decade. These units include the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, my unit, the International Trade Administration, NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the Office of the General Counsel as well. So we have several different units working together on these issues, and the Internet Policy Task Force is an umbrella group that is comprised of 4 different working groups or work streams. One focuses on online copyright, another on data protection and privacy, a third on cybersecurity, and a fourth, which is the group that I co-chair, is on the free flow of information over the internet. Within each of these work streams, we're engaging in wide stakeholder outreach to ask questions about how should we be dealing with these issues and challenges in the next decade, with a focus on what should be the right balance in terms of regulation, both self-regulation, government regulation, best practices, to really foster innovation on the internet. So our focus is on the innovation economy and what we can do to assist businesses and consumers to benefit from innovation, not only domestically, but also internationally as we deal with our trading partners. So we have this task force, and the fourth work stream, the free flows work stream, really came out, we were last out of the gate as we started to see more news stories about restrictions that were being placed on U.S. companies with respect to the free flow of information. The Department of Commerce started to look at this issue and say, is there a problem here? Are different types of restrictions that are being placed on companies as they try to assist in either providing technology or providing content into other markets, are those restrictions harming trade and harming economies, and is there an actual impact? And so that's what we're focusing on now. Many countries have recognized the importance of the free flow of information over the internet as integral to the growth and vibrancy of the internet economy, as well as to the promotion of democratic values, which are essential to free markets and free societies. And in 2008, the OECD members, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, issued something called the Seoul Declaration on the Future of the Internet Economy. In 2008, the Seoul Declaration noted that government should foster creativity in the development, use, and application of the internet through policies that maintain an open environment that supports the free flow of information, research, innovation, entrepreneurship, and business transformation. Now, the reason I'm mentioning the OECD and reading from the Seoul Declaration is because the OECD is focused on markets and democracies. Okay? And so the Department of Commerce, as part of this effort, is also focused on markets and democracies and looking at the free flow of information, not only from the point of view of the freedom of expression, but we're really focusing on the issue of entrepreneurship and innovation. And that's been a missing component, I think, in the debate and the discussion about these issues, that you'll hear from the State Department, you'll hear from other parts of the U.S. government that have different responsibilities, emphasizing freedom of expression, human rights, and other components, but the Department of Commerce's mission is really to advocate with respect to economic and commercial development, and that's what we're doing. So we're trying to look at the issue of restrictions on the free flow of information in terms of the impact that they have on trade, investment, and economic growth. That as we deal with our trading partners around the world, trying to understand the impact of those restrictions, not only to our companies, but to those domestic economies. That if there's a restriction, for example, on voice over internet protocol, does that somehow hinder entrepreneurship and the growth of new applications, new technologies, and new innovation in the markets where the restrictions are taking place? And that really hasn't been as much a focus of the debate to date. That being said, we also have to recognize, as we started engaging in our work, that all governments have restrictions, that every government will place some type of restriction on the types of information that will flow or be accessible on the internet, be it a prohibition on child pornography, be it prohibition on internet gambling, that there are a variety of different types of restrictions. And so we have to start from a premise of understanding that these restrictions exist. So what are we examining at the Department of Commerce? One is, what is the balance between the nature of the restriction, the reason for the restriction, and the burden that's placed on economy and innovation as a result? Meaning, even if there's a good policy in place, is it still a burdensome means of achieving that policy? So we're focusing on trying to understand the balance between the objective of restrictions and then also what are the burdens that are placed on industry and on consumers as a result of those restrictions. We're also trying to examine whether there are restrictions are really just a disguised form of restricting competition on the internet. is a prohibition, again, and I'm using the example of voice over internet protocol, is a prohibition of a company offering that service in a particular market really about a legitimate policy objective of a government, or is it some kind of disguised way of protecting competition within that market? So we're trying to understand those dynamics as well. And third, are there guiding principles for how governments should make decisions about restrictions and the way in which they inform the public and the business community about those restrictions? So to the extent that there are prohibitions on the types of content that will be available in a particular jurisdiction, for example, should there be processes that focus on transparency and due process before that restriction is put in place? Because another issue we're trying to understand is, are content-based or are restrictions on the flow of information on the internet in these different markets clear to all parties concerned, so that businesses, when they enter those markets, understand what their obligations are, what their role is with respect to the government, or are those restrictions sometimes not clearly published and implemented? And if they are they being implemented in an even way? So those are some of the issues we're looking at. Now, how are we engaging in trying to understand these questions? Well, the Internet Policy Task Force, with these 4 work streams, is engaging in outreach in several forms. One is through just more informal meetings and dialogue with civil society and the private sector, just trying to have meetings and understand what the concerns are and what's actually happening. The second is through a publication of what we call a notice of inquiry. So in September, in the Federal Register, we'll actually publish a series of questions where we solicit input from the public around the issues of what type of restrictions do exist over the internet, and what's the impact of those restrictions on businesses and consumers. And that's really important. You will hear and see in the news stories about some of the major companies that have experienced restrictions on the flow of information in different markets. But what we as the Department of Commerce need is more information and more data about what types of restrictions exist, be they content-based, be they prohibitions on the actual use or deployment of certain technologies, and where. So what types of restrictions and in what markets? And that's something we really need to understand. And so we hope the notice of inquiry will help us with that, is just the fact-finding. And what's the impact of those restrictions on consumers and on businesses in terms of both the economic impact, what markets are businesses not going into as a result of those impacts, where are those restrictions overly burdensome, okay? And also, what are some of the solutions that we should advocate in terms of dealing with those restrictions? And the Department of Commerce is very interested in the concept of multi-stakeholder initiatives and multi-stakeholder policy development. There has been discussion, of course, of the Global Network Initiative. It's one example of a multi-stakeholder initiative that's meant to address some of the problems of restrictions on the free flow of information. But we are very curious, and at this point we are asking, is the GNI one vehicle? Are there others? Are there different types of multi-stakeholder initiatives that would help us develop appropriate policy and regulation, be it self-regulation or governmental in the space? Are there other multilateral fora that would be helpful to help us address some of these issues? And we're starting to see that different organizations, including the OECD, the United Nations, are starting to look at these issues as well. So who are the appropriate stakeholders that should be involved in developing the policies? So in addition to just trying to understand what type of restrictions exist, what markets they're in, and what burden or harm they're placing in terms of innovation and economic growth in different markets, we're also looking at the issue of intermediary liability. So it's another issue that we have specific concern about, which is that one way of restricting the flow of information is by placing affirmative burdens on intermediaries with respect to the content that is hosted on different types of websites. So we are also interested in understanding what the different balance should be with respect to the responsibilities of intermediaries and what types of liability should or shouldn't attach to them as they operate in different markets. And we've seen in the United States that we have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, right? That we have actually a safe harbor, we have immunity with a limited number of exceptions so that intermediaries are not per se accountable for the content that they host, because they're not the publishers. So we're interested in seeing whether a Section 230 approach is the right approach. Are there principles that we can articulate that should be or could be applied by other governments, focusing on the issue of the role of intermediaries and whether or not it should be this approach of basically providing an immunity from liability with exceptions. And so we'll be also in the NOI consulting about intermediary liability as well. And finally, there's just a question of what's the role for the United States government and what's the role for the Department of Commerce. Now, the State Department has focused on freedom of expression. The Department of Commerce focusing on investment, trade, and economic growth. The question is, well, how can we actually fulfill that mandate with respect to the free flow of information? One is simply by documenting whether there are problems and restrictions that do harm trade and investment. But moving forward, are there ways that we can deal with this issue in terms of trade agreements, in terms of just reporting? Okay. Should we be an entity that reports on restrictions and what our trading partners are doing with respect to information flows on an annual basis? Should this be something that we do routinely? And on a more day-to-day basis, we advocate within the International Trade Administration for U.S. businesses that to the extent that they encounter a problem with a specific government or trading partner, we're the ones that can advocate for them or on their behalf in the markets in which they operate. And with the technology community, that's something that we want to, through our outreach, alert them to, is the fact that just outside of the larger policy-making arena, on just a very day-to-day basis, our country desk officers are the ones that will actually deal with the companies, communicate with governments and relevant ministries, and try to make a case as to why a certain restriction should or shouldn't be in place. And so we're hoping that we'll get that message out. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts about whether you feel that the trade and investment angle is an important one. We certainly think it is, and we hope that you'll certainly engage in our discussion through the notice of inquiry. Thank you.
Turned on, I hope. Okay, well, I want to thank NDN and Sam and Simon for the invitation, and especially for promoting discussion of this important issue. The way I see it, the internet offers enormous potential for advancing human freedom, and yet the internet is under assault from authoritarian governments. And most of what I want to talk about is how do we fight for the space to keep it open. First, in terms of potential, I think one way to sum it up is that the area certainly of news and much of communication has moved from a vertical model to a horizontal model. In the broadcast days, there were a limited number of broadcasters and editors who essentially decided what news was important enough for you to hear about, and they broadcast that to you, and you could pick your newspaper or pick your channel, but otherwise the stories were shaped by the editors of major newspapers and broadcasters of television news and so on. In this day and age, with Web 2.0, pretty much anyone can set up shop and become a producer of content and distribute that content very quickly and around the globe. And we see that in cases where there are demonstrations. There was reference earlier to the situation in Iran last year, and any citizen could capture some of the police beatings on film, upload it, and tell the world what was happening. Now, we know that, and pro-democracy activists know it, and unfortunately, dictators know that too. And they've invested more and more in restricting the internet. Freedom House launched a pilot study last year called Freedom on the Net. And we're in the process of beefing it up and expanding it. And what we found, and similar to other leading researchers like the Berkman Center at Harvard, is that the restrictions on the internet are increasing. They're also becoming a lot more sophisticated. And if you look at the most restrictive environments like China, like Iran, like Tunisia, there are in fact multiple layers of restrictions. You have, most recent example, essentially closing down microblogging sites. Twitter gets shut down. In the case of China last year, after the Uyghur riots, they essentially cut off an entire province from the internet. Now, you can also make the technical filtering a lot more precise, down to keywords, domain names, and so on. More and more we see the human censors, cases where individual bloggers will get a phone call from security services telling them to take down certain content. There's reference made to intermediary liability, or what we would call outsourcing. And in more and more countries, cyber cafes are asked to check IDs of people who go use the computers there, and maybe keep records of the browsing. Web hosting companies can lose their business licenses over whatever content is posted on their sites or the sites they host if the government objects. Then in addition to all that, there is the old-fashioned repression, beating up, attacking bloggers, throwing them in jail. If you look at a case like Egypt, there's very little technical filtering. The internet is quite open, but some of the leading bloggers have suffered a great deal, and they really are made cases, test cases by the government. The government really wants to make sure the message gets out that anyone who's too critical will be silenced, or they'll make every effort to silence them. I think it's also worth noting that this is all taking place behind a much larger trend in a decline in freedom. As many of you know, Freedom House issues annual ratings of political rights and civil liberties, and we have seen 5 years of decline, what we call a global political recession. So if we want to keep the internet open, if we want to promote the free flow of information, not just in OECD countries, but other emerging markets and certainly important markets like China and elsewhere, we need policies to really push for this. And because the efforts of authoritarian governments are so concerted and sophisticated, I think U.S. policy needs to be equally sophisticated and multifaceted. Fortunately, we've moved the debate in a couple years, but moved it quite a ways from the efforts to find, the one technology that's going to break through the Great Firewall. I think people realize it's not going to be that easy. This challenge has to be dealt with in many different ways. And I would summarize them as 4 levels of policy that I think need to be pursued to promote internet freedom. The first is to build or strengthen the international consensus for the free flow of information. And what this means is where there are standards, strengthening them, making clear, for instance, that Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to the internet, that this is an international norm that should be respected. And it also means bringing together stakeholders who share a common interest and commitment to internet freedom. I think there's more that governments, democratic governments, can do to work together on this, and certainly welcome and encourage more of the multi-stakeholder approach that we're seeing more and more of. The second aspect of policy is to stop U.S., European, and other companies from abetting internet censorship and surveillance. What happened here in the U.S., the Global Network Initiative, some of the draft laws like the Global Online Freedom Act, came out in response to the Shitao case, and basically trying to address situations where internet service providers might be helping repressive regimes crack down on peaceful dissent. In Europe, you see a great deal of interest in corporate codes of conduct, and I think this is a response to the Nokia Siemens case, where Nokia Siemens sold Iran monitoring equipment, which would be perfectly normal in a country where the courts function, where there's due process, where rights are generally respected, but in the hands of a brutal Iranian regime is, not surprisingly, this equipment is used to track down dissidents and get them in trouble. I'm concerned that many of these efforts are reactive, that it takes a big case, frankly, a big scandal before governments and companies and human rights groups focus on these issues and put enough effort into avoiding these kind of cases. And I think there are ways to sort of get ahead of this, including, I would propose, some export restrictions, limiting some of the technologies that should be freely available, but when they find their ways into the hands of repressive regimes, are used for censorship, surveillance, and repression. The third area of policy should be about empowering netizens. There are, I would say, a great deal of the dynamism in places like China. It comes from bloggers, ordinary citizens who are just on their own initiatives finding ways to sort of push open more space. And often their creativity, their innovations are an important part of this struggle to keep space open on the internet. There's a great deal of interest among activist circles in the Ushahidi platform, which is basically for mapping incidents of electoral-related violence or violations during an election period. This is a platform created by Kenyans on their own initiative. It didn't take a big donor program and funding, but now that there is a lot of interest in replicating it and adapting it in different parts of the world, that is a kind of initiative that can be supported. Another dimension of this is to give netizens a greater voice. In many of the policy forums, like the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, other policy discussions, the US, European countries will really have multiple stakeholders. We'll have government, we'll have companies, we'll have human rights groups presenting different perspectives. From authoritarian countries, including China, you tend to get one perspective, and that's the government perspective, and the government claiming to speak on behalf of all citizens on these issues and propagating the idea that citizens, in the name of stability, accept censorship. And in fact, we know there are many, many Chinese who don't accept censorship, who in fact take great risks to challenge censorship. And there are ways that we should give them greater opportunities to have their voices heard internationally and especially in international policy forums. And lastly, and this is probably some of the hardest work, is I think the challenges, the restrictions on internet use need to be challenged diplomatically and preferably through multilateral efforts. I was rereading Secretary Clinton's speech on internet freedom, and I think as a overall policy statement is a big step forward. It presents an important vision about what the internet can offer in terms of human improvement and also many of the challenges. And I found it interesting, after she gave that speech, she took some questions, and there was one, an activist from a Vietnamese human rights group who essentially said, one of our activists, a blogger, is in jail, recently arrested for something. He or she wrote, "What can you do about that?" And then a couple of questions later, there was a representative from a small, I think a software company that had been working in China, and essentially said the government is putting pressure on us to help the government monitor personal use. What can you do for my company now? And this, it takes diplomatic initiative. It also takes political capital. I mean, I think there are real trade-offs between the many interests that the U.S. has with China and I think needs to pursue, but also if we're serious about pushing back on their restrictions, that will take some political capital, and hire U.S. government officials saying this is important, and if we risk angering the Chinese government and making other issues more complicated, we're willing to do that. So that's an overview, and I guess we'll go on to questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you all for being here today. If you're watching online, you can send your questions to questions@ndn.org, and I will hopefully receive them on my BlackBerry, which I just dropped on the floor, and should start up in just a moment. I'm going to seize the prerogative of the moderator and ask the first question about the issue of intermediary liability, which you both brought up in different constructs. One of the more curious and maybe surprising things about internet freedom issues is that we have these issues with countries that we think of as open democratic societies. Google executives are being held responsible for a YouTube video, legally responsible in Italy. Google Video, not YouTube. Thank you, Bob. Yahoo has run into trouble in France for returning search results that were unsavory to the French government. I'm wondering, how do you address these issues? Is there a trade angle to this when we're dealing with countries that we are on very friendly terms with? Is it a diplomatic issue? What's the right approach here?
It's a trade issue with a little t. I'm not talking about multilateral or bilateral trade engagement per se, but about the economic argument behind what are the right incentive structures. When I mentioned Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, you'd have a lot of policymakers and industry in the U.S. who would say that creating that kind of safe harbor from immunity was what allowed the internet to flourish in terms of the types of content and the types of applications that we have today. So it's really about that, is trying to say to other countries, as you look at the way in which you deal with intermediaries and the responsibilities you may or may not place on them, what kind of incentive structures do you want to create that are going to promote economic growth? So I think that's what we're looking at, is to say, and the OECD is currently looking at the issue of intermediaries. Who are intermediaries, and what types of guiding principles should we have in place? And when I use that term, for example, immunity with exceptions, that's one way of looking at it. Should we at least, can different governments agree to that idea in terms of really starting with immunity, and to the extent that there are specific exceptions for when you might impose liability or obligations, that should be the right structure?
I look at it, it's quite similar to debates we've been having for a long time on free expression issues, and the U.S. tends to have a much more expansive view of this than even European countries. And I mean, in the internet field, obviously there is a concern that restrictions, and I'm not talking just about the excesses of the Google video case in Italy, but even more narrow and justifiable restrictions in European countries then get used as an excuse by China, Iran, others, Tunisia, to say, well, you guys have restrictions, we need them too. I would make the following distinctions. The first of all is that any limits on expression, I think, need to be narrowly defined. And, you know, in cases in Europe, denying the Holocaust is a crime. But it's pretty clear what that is. The problem is in a place like China or Tunisia, and you know, much of the Arab world, the red line is, it's very unclear, and it's shifting, and it's something as vague as you know, insulting the nation, or you know, weakening the national character, which can apply to any number of things. So I think you know, certainly look for any restriction on content to be very narrowly defined. The other distinction is due process. I mean, do you have a functioning court system, or are the rights of citizens generally respected or not? And where in countries where you don't have that, then restrictions and intermediary liability is normally used for repression. It's used to silence critics of the government, or people who want to promote alternative views. And then the last part is the transparency. I mean, we, you know, if say there's a government regulation in Vietnam adding requirements to cyber cafe owners on monitoring their users, you know, something that broad will generally be known. But some of the censorship isn't, you know, it's actively denied by the Chinese government. I mean, they pretend it's not happening. And, you know, if at least, you know, internet service providers or other intermediaries, if they know what is, you know, clearly what's expected of them, what are the red lines, you know, at least they're in a better position to push back on it.
Thanks. I'd like to open it for questions. Sure.
Hi, I'm Bob Borston with Google, and I'm rather depressed about what you had to say, Anita. I'm depressed because a year ago and 8 months, when the Obama administration came into power, they specifically said they would have a multi-department interagency task force on internet freedom that was supposed to be run out of the NSC. Now we have state doing one thing, we have commerce saying another. We have the NSC quiet for the last 6 months, not because they don't mean well, because they're quiet, and because we have USTR also involved. There is no coordinated effort in the government as it stands now, and that's a problem. I also am really disappointed to hear you say, are there more multi-stakeholder initiatives that might be out there aside from the GNI? I'm disappointed for 3 reasons. One, the State Department has promoted the GNI and has asked companies that don't belong to it right now, specifically telecom companies and hardware companies and other software companies, to join it. Undersecretary Hormats himself asked for that. Second, the Europeans at the meeting that took place on the Franco-Dutch initiative all came out saying we don't need more organizations. What we need is for European companies to join the GNI. Finally, I'm upset about this because it just seems that Commerce may be out of step here on what is going on with the GNI, even after the new executive director came over to Commerce and explained it to you and said that it was flexible and open to any new companies that wanted to come in. What more do you want than an organization that takes companies, human rights groups, socially responsible investors, and academics, puts them all in the same room, gets along let me repeat that, actually gets along and then starts to work. What more do you want?
Well, the you, I hope you're asking the you as in the Department of Commerce or the government. So your first comment relates to interagency coordination. As I said before, as the new bureaucrat, there is interagency coordination. We are speaking to, we're working with OSTP and certainly with state. So, I mean, state and commerce engage in active dialogue, and we do with USTR as well. I mean, we're hoping that a lot of the inquiry will feed into a larger interagency process. The timing and how that will manifest, I can't speak for other agencies, but I can speak for the fact that the Department of Commerce coordinates with the others. On the GNI, and when I use the term multi-stakeholder initiative or multilateral fora, I should say, speaking as myself, that we're using that term very broadly. So the OECD, for example, is not a competing forum, and I'm not saying that that is the appropriate forum to deal with certain issues, but it's not a competitor to the GNI.
And in fact, it was at the OECD where they had this meeting.
Right, they did, on the intermediaries, yes.
And I'm totally for the OECD.
Yeah.
We could have a long argument about whether the UN should be involved in this at all.
Right, and what I was saying is that there are a variety of issues at play here. We certainly have engaged and met with the GNI and certainly appreciate the efforts that are going on. We're trying to understand what the GNI is doing in terms of expanding membership. We also, as a Department of Commerce, do have a responsibility to listen to and deal with a variety of companies in the United States. Some are members of the GNI, some are not. I'm not making any value statement as to the value, as to whether the GNI versus another multi-stakeholder forum is appropriate. What I was saying is that there may be a variety of avenues for developing policy. The GNI is an important one. That's why, as you noticed with my remarks, it was the only organization outside of the OECD that I'm mentioning as in existence and working on these issues. The OECD might be another.
But nonetheless, state has positively supported the effort of the GNI and urged American companies to come into it. So you are not in the same place as state. And I think that your folks ought to talk to Hormats and figure out where the U.S. government stands.
And I appreciate, and I'm sure the Undersecretary Hormats will speak to our principles. I have to just respond by saying, as the Department of Commerce, we do have a responsibility to listen to the concerns and the interests of all of the different companies, some who are members and some who are not. And just at this point, we're engaging in peer inquiry. So I take your point and certainly, hope that you'll communicate that to our senior staff.
Thanks. Question over here. Could you wait for the microphone so we can catch you for all eternity on YouTube?
Hi, I'm Don Gable from GW. I was wondering if you could talk about U.S. restrictions on trading with the enemy that has been interpreted by companies such as GoDaddy and MSN Messenger as meaning that they should restrict access to their services for people who are living in countries that fall under that act.
Right. I mean, these are parts of sort of broader sanctions on places like Iran and Syria. And, I mean, the compliance with, my understanding of this issue is that in the case of GoDaddy, that they decided not to host some sites from Iranians because they weren't sure whether or not they might.
But they actually block access to the sites that they own the domain name. So, for example, if you are on the island of Cuba, you're coming from a particular IP address. There's only a couple. And if you try to access a website that the domain is owned by GoDaddy, or you cannot get there. You'll get a message that says, "Sorry, you can't. You're trying to access this website from a blockaded or embargoed country," or whatever it's called. So.
Yeah, I mean,
of the internet for the people in the countries that were actually saying we would like to have access to the internet. So. Yeah.
Look, I agree it's definitely unhelpful. What we work with a number of activists from many countries, often restricted environments, including those countries under sanctions, and we advise them when you have a choice, you might want to just have your site hosted in Canada or Europe so you don't have to deal with this kind of stuff.
Thanks.
But it's not about the citizens of those countries where they're hosting their websites. It's about them accessing any website that happens to be, and then also it's those citizens of that country, those countries cannot use MSN Messenger. They don't have access to it because MSN Messenger is blocking them from using it. There's several companies that have just recently decided, GoDaddy's been doing it for a long time, but in the last year, MSN Messenger and an open source website has been doing this as well. I think maybe it has changed, at least in respect to Cuba. I'm not sure because the president has made some changes in that policy, but it just seems completely opposite of what the Secretary of State's message was.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as a general approach, the government should be more sophisticated about how it does it, and it did loosen some of the restrictions on use of software and some applications in places like Syria and Iran. I mean, when I talk about restrictions on technology, you know, I have in mind stuff like Net Nanny software, which, you know, it used in the U.S. or most OECD countries or a democratic country, it means that parents and schools and teachers are using it to manage what children see and don't see. In the hands of repressive regimes, and there are, you know, indications this is the case in several Middle Eastern countries, that basic software is used to filter political content or essentially decide what, you know, citizens, grown-ups can talk about, you know, social issues or other important issues. So I think, you know, there need to be better distinctions on what technologies are actually empowering citizens and helping them access global information and get around censorship versus used by governments to censor and or conduct surveillance and monitor the online activities of citizens.
I would just add that since Secretary Clinton's speech in January, in addition to all the diplomatic work that the State Department is doing, they've had a team working on sort of updating policy and sort of going through restrictions on, for example, restrictions on software, figuring out which software benefits the government versus which software benefits the supposed dissidents or the prospective dissidents, and hopefully reducing restrictions on the software that would be helpful. Question, Robert?
Hi, my name's Robert Guerra. I'm from Freedom House. I just maybe want to comment on a couple of questions. I think getting back to Bob's comment, it's all an issue about coordination. I think when we're talking about Treasury and their sanctions, there's a couple of other issues. So if you just deconstruct kind of what you're talking about in regards to Cuba, if people from Cuba can't access websites in the U.S., is it a DNS issue? And in fact, they should, because the DNS is a global resource that shouldn't be blocked anywhere. If it's one of hosting, then is the websites that's been hosted for people in Cuba, did people realize that they're going to be sanctioned? The other issue that's come up is, I wouldn't say GoDaddy, but the issue of Bluehost, who was just afraid about sanctions and started shutting down not only websites of Cubans, but Zimbabweans and Iranians as well. And further clarification from Treasury and others in the government in terms of what are things that they can't do and can't do, because shutting down freedom of expression in parts of the world is really problematic. And on the other hand, as you were saying, Sam, the State Department is being really keen, particularly since Clinton's speech, about the free flow of information. So you have, on one aspect, Treasury sanctions affecting people, and so the broader issue is one of communications and bringing all the different stakeholders together. It's not easy, and it takes time, and having venues like the GNI and elsewhere, again, enough hasn't taken place that we have to hear about these things and people can't deal with them. As you know, I say, and Daniel and others at Freedom House, is while we're trying to deal with these issues and we're taking a lot of time, the internet is moving ahead. Every 6 months on the internet is light years ahead in policy space. And if we don't act now and we don't act quickly, governments are going to do more, and people are going to be more repressed. And so I push it back to the government is, you want to do all these great things? Great. Start doing things. And, as I told the French at the Franco-Dutch meeting, if you're looking at other spaces, it's great, but the internet is going to move ahead. And by the time you're looking at great spaces, the internet's going to change. And so, support, other initiatives that may not be perfect, but they're at least an initiative that people are talking. And there's a lot more that could be done. And, and I'll say forums like this where these issues come up and people discuss and go back and react is particularly useful. So, appreciate the efforts of NDN, and there's a space tomorrow taking place as well. So the more of these we have, all the better. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the audience here or anything from online? If not, then I guess if we've identified collaboration and staying in touch as part of the mountain we have to climb, then I hope you will all stay in touch with NDN on our website, on the blog Global Mobile, and you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter also at ndn.org. I hope you join me in thanking Anita and Daniel. And thank you all for coming today.